There is a collection of clay tablets in the Mesopotamian gallery of the British Museum in London. Some are no larger than a human palm. They are pressed with cuneiform script so fine that early archaeologists needed magnifying lenses to read it. They were excavated from the ruins of the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, pulled from the rubble by Hormuzd Rassam and his team in the 1850s, and they have been catalogued under K numbers in the Kuyunjik collection ever since. They are not king lists, they are not trade records, they are not hymns to the gods, they are something else entirely. The tablets belong to a series the Sumerians called Udug-hul. In Akkadian, the later scribes titled it Utukku Lemnutu. Both names translate the same way, evil demons. But that translation, the one printed on every museum placard and in every introductory textbook, may be the single most misleading label in the history of ancient studies. Because what these tablets actually describe in clinical and repeating detail is not a demon in any sense a modern reader would recognize. What they describe is something that attaches to a human being and feeds. The Udug-hul series survives in multiple copies spanning more than 1,000 years of continuous transmission. The oldest fragments date to the Old Babylonian period, roughly the early 2nd millennium BCE. But the canonical version, the one that was collected and standardized under the Neo-Assyrian scribal apparatus, runs to 16 tablets. Markham of University College London spent years reconstructing that canonical edition. He assembled fragments from the British Museum, from the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, and from collections in Baghdad and Philadelphia. His critical edition was published in 2007 as Volume 5 of the State Archives of Assyria Cuneiform Texts through the Neo-Assyrian Text Corpus Project in Helsinki. What Geller produced is the most complete edition of these texts that currently exists in any language, and what those texts contain is not what most people expect from an ancient religious document. The series does not tell a story, it does not praise a deity, it does not record a ritual for a seasonal festival or a royal coronation. It reads, from the first tablet to the 16th, like a field manual. The entities it describes are catalogued by type, their behaviours are listed, their preferred methods of attachment are specified, and the symptoms they produce in the human host are described with a precision that, in any other context, would be called diagnostic. The conventional word for what the Udug-hul describes is possession, but possession implies a spiritual framework, good and evil, sin and redemption, the soul as contested territory between divine and infernal forces. The Sumerian framework has none of that architecture. The Sumerian framework is mechanical. Something arrives. It attaches. It consumes. The human deteriorates in predictable stages. And the Sumerians documented those stages the same way they documented the movements of Venus across the evening sky. Not with prayer, not with allegory, but with observation. The thesis of this video is not that the Sumerians believed in parasites. It is that they described them, that the descriptions are specific enough to be compared against observable phenomena, that the symptom progressions they recorded map onto categories modern medicine recognizes but attributes to entirely different causes, and that no published academic work has engaged directly with the question of why these texts are so clinically precise, if they are, as the textbooks uniformly state, nothing more than superstitious literature. If you find that the academic literature on texts like these has been incomplete, if you suspect that artifacts already sitting in museums contain information no one has taken seriously on its own terms, this channel exists for that work. Subscribe only if that is the question you have been carrying. The rest of us continue. The conventional reading of the Udug-hul series is well established and internally coherent. Mainstream Assyriology classifies these tablets as incantation literature, a genre of cuneiform text designed to be recited by a ritual specialist known in Akkadian as an ashipu during therapeutic procedures. The standard interpretation, articulated by scholars from Samuel Noah Kramer in the mid-20th century, through Elio Oppenheim and refined by modern specialists including Geller himself, holds that the entities described in the Udug-hul are literary constructs. They are personifications of illness, misfortune, and social disruption, not descriptions of independently existing beings, but culturally embedded explanations for the experience of suffering. This framework has deep roots. Kramer, who spent decades at the University of Pennsylvania Museum translating Sumerian literary texts, established the foundational reading of Sumerian mythology as a complex symbolic system expressing the Mesopotamians' understanding of natural and social forces. Oppenheim, in his influential 1964 work Ancient Mesopotamia, Portrait of a Dead Civilization, argued that modern scholars should resist the temptation to take Mesopotamian religious texts at face value, and should instead read them as cultural documents expressing the worldview of their authors. This hermeneutic, reading the texts as expressions of worldview rather than as records of experience, became the default framework for all subsequent scholarship on the Udug-hul and related texts. Franz Wigermann of the University of Leiden, who published the foundational study of Mesopotamian protective spirits in 1992, catalogued dozens of entity types from the cuneiform record and classified them within a taxonomy that the Mesopotamians maintained with remarkable consistency across centuries and across the full geographic range of cuneiform culture, from the Persian Gulf to the upper Euphrates. Wigermann's work is meticulous. His taxonomy identifies classes of entities, distinguishes protective from hostile types, maps their relationships to specific locations and architectural features, and traces their iconographic evolution across periods. But his operating framework, the framework shared by every mainstream scholar who has touched these texts, treats the taxonomy as cultural production. The Sumerians organized their demons the way they organized their gods, their city-states, their irrigation systems. It was an expression of worldview and of institutional order, not of empirical observation. The entities in the Udug-hul, under this reading, are metaphors. Sophisticated metaphors. Culturally embedded metaphors. Metaphors that served therapeutic functions within a medical system that did not distinguish between psychological and supernatural causation. But metaphors nonetheless. The illness is real. The suffering is real. The demon is the explanation the culture provided. This reading is coherent. It is internally consistent. It accounts for the existence of the texts within a framework that requires no entities to actually exist, and it does not account for what the texts actually say. What the texts actually say is this. The Udug-hul series describes 7 principal entities, 7 distinct agents, each with specific behavioral signatures, each producing a specific constellation of symptoms in the human they attach to. Not 7 categories of bad fortune. Not 7 poetic expressions of existential anxiety. 7 distinguishable patterns with distinguishable onset sequences, distinguishable progression timelines, and distinguishable prescribed responses. The scribes who compiled the Canonical series in the 1st millennium BCE were working from source material that was already ancient, material that had been copied from old Babylonian originals, checked against intermediary versions, and transmitted across centuries with a fidelity that scholars have compared to the transmission of astronomical data in the Mulapin series, the oldest known systematic star catalogue. That comparison is significant. The Mulapin was transmitted with care because it contained observational data that needed to remain accurate for practical use: navigation, agriculture, calendar regulation, and the timing of religious festivals that were keyed to celestial events. The penalty for inaccurate astronomical data was practical failure, the wrong planting date, the missed festival, the navigation error. The Udug-hul was transmitted with comparable care across the same centuries and through the same scribal institutions. The comparison is rarely drawn because the 2 text types are assigned to different genres, the Mulapin to astronomical literature, the Udug-hul to incantation literature, and the genre boundary discourages comparison. But the transmission protocols are the same, the colophon formats are the same, the error correction practices, the use of variant readings and the notation of discrepancies between source copies are the same. Whatever the Udug-hul contained, the scribal system treated it as material that needed to remain accurate. The question of what practical consequence followed from inaccuracy, the question of what would go wrong if the texts were transmitted inaccurately, has not been asked, because asking it requires entertaining the possibility that the text described something real enough to get wrong. Joanne Scurlock of Elmhurst University and Burton Anderson spent years compiling what may be the most important cross-reference in modern Assyriology. Their 2005 volume, published by the University of Illinois Press, is titled Diagnoses in Assyrian and Babylonian Medicine. It runs to more than 800 pages. What Scurlock and Anderson did was take the diagnostic entries scattered across the cuneiform medical and incantation corpus, entries that describe symptoms, attribute them to specific causes including specific entity types, and prescribe specific countermeasures, and organize them into a unified reference framework arranged by symptom category. The result is a document that reads less like an anthology of ancient superstition and more like a differential diagnostic manual. Headache attributed to one entity type, wasting attributed to another, sleep disruption with night visitation, cognitive fragmentation, speech loss, behavioral transformation, each mapped to a specific cause within the Mesopotamian system, each associated with a specific countermeasure protocol, each distinguished from superficially similar presentations attributed to other causes. Scurlock and Anderson do not claim the entities are real. They are mainstream scholars operating within the standard metaphor framework, but they published the data, they organized it, they made the internal structure visible, and that structure has a character that no one has explained on its own terms. What Scurlock and Anderson's work makes visible, perhaps for the first time in a single reference volume, is the sheer scale of the Mesopotamian diagnostic enterprise. The cuneiform medical corpus does not contain a handful of vague references to demons causing illness. It contains hundreds of diagnostic entries, organized into series that were themselves organized into a curriculum. The Sakhi-Ku, the diagnostic handbook attributed to the legendary sage Asagil-Kinapli, who is thought to have compiled or standardized the series in the city of Borsippa during the late 2nd millennium BCE, runs to 40 tablets and contains thousands of individual diagnostic observations structured in conditional format. If the patient presents this symptom in combination with that symptom, the cause is this entity, and the prognosis is this. If the same first symptom appears in combination with a different second symptom, the cause is a different entity, and the prognosis is different. If both symptoms disappear within a specific time frame, the attachment is considered transient. If they persist beyond that time frame, the attachment is considered established, and the treatment changes. The conditional format is significant because it mirrors the format used in Mesopotamian astronomical texts. If Venus rises at a specific point on the horizon in a specific month, the omen is this. If it rises at a different point, the omen is different. Both text types use the same logical structure to encode observational data. Both require the reader to evaluate a current presentation against a library of documented patterns. Both assume that the patterns are stable enough to predict outcomes. The Sakhi-Ku assumes that entity-mediated afflictions are stable enough to diagnose differentially and to predict prognostically. That assumption only makes sense if the patterns were observed, documented, and confirmed across cases. Scurlock and Anderson did not invent this structure. They documented it, they translated it, they organized it for modern cross-reference, and the structure they documented has a character that speaks for itself. It is the character of a system that was used. The question that emerges from their compilation, the question that no published paper has directly engaged with, is deceptively simple. If these are metaphors, why do they have differential diagnoses? Metaphors do not produce symptom trees. Literary constructs do not have behavioral signatures that differ from one another in reproducible ways across copies separated by centuries and hundreds of kilometers. And superstitious texts do not typically include what amount to decision protocols. If the patient presents this cluster of symptoms, the cause is entity A. If the patient presents that cluster, the cause is entity B. If the clusters overlap, the cause is a compound attachment requiring a combined countermeasure protocol with elements drawn from both individual protocols. That is not mythology. That is triage. And it was pressed into clay in the 2nd millennium BCE. It is worth pausing here to note what has not happened in the academic record. No peer-reviewed paper has been published that directly addresses the diagnostic precision of the Udug-hul symptom descriptions and provides an explanation for that precision within the metaphor framework. The texts have been translated. They have been philologically annotated at the level of individual sign values. Their grammar has been analysed. Their variant readings have been catalogued. Their scribal traditions have been mapped. Their place in the literary canon has been established. But the content, the specific, differential, reproducible symptom descriptions that survive across copies and across centuries, has been treated as background detail, interesting for what it reveals about Mesopotamian conceptual categories and therapeutic practices. Not interesting as a body of observations that might describe something real. The asymmetry in the academic treatment is striking and has not been addressed. When cuneiform astronomical texts describe planetary positions with precision, modern scholars take those observations seriously. They check them against computed ephemerides. They use them to calibrate ancient chronologies. The precision is treated as evidence that the Mesopotamians were observing real celestial events and recording them accurately. When cuneiform medical incantation texts describe symptom progressions with comparable precision, specificity of onset, specificity of sequence, specificity of differential markers, the precision is attributed to cultural elaboration. The observations are not checked against anything. The symptom descriptions are not compared to modern diagnostic categories to test for correspondence. The standard applied to astronomical observations and the standard applied to entity symptom observations are different, and no published argument explains why they should be. The 7 entities described in the Udug-hul series produce 7 distinct symptom constellations. The texts do not number them 1 through 7 in the way a modern clinical manual would number its chapters. But the Canonical series organizes them into distinguishable categories, and the diagnostic texts compiled by Scurlock and Anderson, cross-referenced against Geller's critical edition and against the Sakiku Diagnostic Handbook, allow each constellation to be reconstructed with reasonable confidence from the published record. What follows is drawn from that record. The terms are translated. The symptom descriptions are documented across multiple copies, from multiple sites and multiple centuries. The attributions are as the cuneiform scribes recorded them across more than 1,000 years of institutional transmission. The first sign is disruption of sleep, not the ordinary sleeplessness of worry or physical discomfort, which the Mesopotamian medical texts address separately, with herbal prescriptions and sleep postures, but a specific and distinctive pattern. Sleep comes, but it brings visitation. The cuneiform terminology describes the entity arriving at the boundary between waking and sleeping, the threshold the Sumerians considered uniquely permeable, the liminal state in which the Z is most exposed and most accessible. The person wakes in distress, not gradually, but with sudden sharp awareness, as if startled by something that was present in the room. The text described the progression with characteristic specificity. First, the disruptions are occasional, one night in several, then nightly. Then the person begins to dread the approach of darkness itself, not from fear of the night, but from the certainty that sleep will bring contact. Modern sleep medicine classifies presentations matching this. Description under the parasomnias: sleep terror disorder, nightmare disorder, sleep paralysis with hypnopompic phenomena. The diagnostic categories exist. The symptom descriptions match. The Sumerian texts classify the same presentation as the first indication that something has arrived and established initial contact with the host. The second sign is appetite failure and progressive physical wasting. The texts describe the body consuming itself, not from a disease of the organs in the conventional Mesopotamian sense, but from a depletion of Z. The Sumerian concept of Z has no single English equivalent. It is variously translated as breath, as life force, as the animating essence that distinguishes a living body from a corpse. The word appears across hundreds of cuneiform texts in contexts ranging from cosmology to medicine to legal oaths, always carrying the sense of the vital substrate without which biological processes continue, but the person is no longer fully present. The entity, according to the Udug-hul text, consumes Z. The body, progressively deprived of its animating substance, begins to deteriorate in ways that are visible, but that the ASU, the herbal practitioner, cannot treat with conventional remedies. The person may continue to eat, but nourishment does not sustain them. The weight falls, the strength diminishes, the skin changes, the eyes lose what the texts describe as their light. The wasting is not attributed to a blockage, to a poison, to a humoral imbalance. It is attributed to a drain. Something is taking from the person faster than the person's body can replenish what is being taken. The texts describe this with the matter-of-fact tone of a field report, not the dramatic tone of a curse. The third sign is cognitive disruption. The cuneiform phrases describe a state in which the person's thinking becomes disordered and unreliable. Decisions that were previously routine become impossible. The person cannot hold a sequence of thoughts to completion. They begin tasks and lose track of the task's purpose midway through. They repeat actions without remembering having performed them. The diagnostic texts attribute this specifically to the entity's interference with what the Sumerians called the ear of the heart, the internal faculty through which a person receives and processes meaning. The Sumerians located this faculty not in the brain. They did not have a concept of the brain as the seat of cognition, but in the chest, the region they associated with understanding, judgment, and the integration of sensory experience into coherent thought. The entity's interference with this faculty is described not as destruction, but as interception. The ear of the heart still functions, but what it receives is no longer reliable. The person hears, but what they hear is distorted. They think, but the thoughts do not connect. This is not a generic description of confusion written by someone unfamiliar with cognitive states. It is a description of a specific mechanism of cognitive interference attributed to a specific external cause. The fourth sign is social withdrawal. The person stops speaking to their family. They avoid communal gatherings, shared meals, the rituals of mutual obligation that structured Mesopotamian daily life, visiting a sick neighbour, participating in canal maintenance, attending the temple festivals that mark the agricultural calendar. They lose interest in the reciprocal relationships that previously gave their days structure and meaning. The texts describe this not as a choice the person makes, not as laziness, not as moral failure, not as deliberate rejection of community, but as a consequence of the attachment process itself. The entity, having established itself and begun to consume Z at a steady rate, isolates the host. The isolation is described in functional terms, not moral ones. It serves a purpose within the parasitic process. It reduces the host's exposure to the social interactions that, within the Mesopotamian therapeutic framework, replenish ZI, shared food, shared labour, shared speech, shared ritual participation. Each of these communal activities was understood by the Mesopotamians to contribute to the maintenance of Z, the way food contributes to the maintenance of the body. An entity that feeds on Z benefits from isolating its host from the activities that replenish Z. The texts describe this with the cold clarity of an ecological observation. The parasite manages its food supply. The word the texts use for the person's state at this stage carries connotations not of absence but of occupation. The person's social capacity has not disappeared. It has been occupied. Something else now fills the space where social engagement used to operate. The fifth sign is the one the texts describe in the most disturbing and the most specific terms. The person's inner voice changes. The cuneiform phrases vary across copies and across periods, but the consistent element, the element that survives every transmission of the text, is this. The person begins to experience thoughts that are not their own, not voices in the auditory hallucination sense, not commands from an external source that the person recognizes as foreign, something subtler and far more dangerous, an alteration of the internal monologue itself. The thoughts that arise feel native. They feel like the person's own reasoning, the person's own preferences, the person's own conclusions drawn from the person's own experience. But they drive the person toward choices that serve the entity rather than the host. The texts say the person's word is seized, their intention is redirected. They believe they are choosing freely, but the choices are not free. They are being steered by something that has learned to speak in the host's own cognitive voice. And the person does not know it. This is the fifth sign. It is described across multiple copies as the most dangerous stage precisely because it is invisible to the person experiencing it. The Sumerians noted this with an explicitness that is difficult to dismiss. They wrote that the fifth stage is the one in which the person will deny the attachment most vigorously, because the entity has now reached the very faculty by which the person would detect and recognize its presence. The organ of self-awareness has been compromised by the thing that self-awareness would need to detect. This description was pressed into clay tablets in the 2nd millennium BCE. It has been housed in the British Museum for more than a century and a half. It describes, in functional and operational terms, a parasitic manipulation of host cognition, the targeted compromise of the detection mechanism itself. If this is a metaphor, it is the most precisely engineered metaphor in the entire ancient record. And if it is not a metaphor, then the Sumerians documented something that modern neuroscience and clinical psychology are only now beginning to describe in their own vocabulary. The phenomenon of ego-syntonic intrusion, of thought patterns that mimic the architecture of self-generated cognition so closely that the person experiencing them cannot distinguish parasite from self. The sixth sign is somatic pain without visible cause. The person experiences headaches, pressure in the chest, sensations of heat or cold that do not correspond to any external temperature change, pain that migrates through the body without settling in any organ the SU, the herbal and surgical practitioner, can identify or treat. The diagnostic texts are particularly specific here. They include criteria for distinguishing between pain caused by entity attachment and pain caused by what the Mesopotamians recognized as natural illness, infection, injury, organ malfunction. The distinction is not a minor footnote. It is a formal diagnostic category within the system. It implies that the Mesopotamian practitioner was expected to evaluate a patient presenting with pain and determine, using specific observational criteria documented in the texts, whether the pain had a material cause requiring the Asu or an entity cause requiring the Ashipu. The existence of this differential category is itself significant. It means the Mesopotamians did not attribute all illness to supernatural causes. They attributed specific illness presentations with specific features that distinguished them from natural illness, to specific entity types. That is not superstition in the casual sense. That is a diagnostic protocol with inclusion and exclusion criteria. The seventh sign is described as the final stage of the progression. The person is no longer recognized by those who knew them. Their behavior, their speech patterns, their emotional responses, their orientation toward the world have changed so fundamentally that the people closest to them, family, colleagues, the members of their household, describe them as absent. The body is present. The body moves, eats, speaks, but the person who inhabited it is not there. The cuneiform texts use a phrase that Geller translates in his critical edition as the person being replaced, not destroyed, not killed, not cast out, replaced. The entity has consumed enough Z that what remains is a biological vessel operating under a different directive. The Sumerians did not frame this final stage as death. They framed it as substitution. Something else is now operating the body. And the original occupant, the Z, the animating essence, the thing that made that specific person, has been consumed. These 7 constellations are not scattered randomly across the cuneiform record like fragments of folklore collected by chance. They appear in diagnostic sequences that follow the progression from first sign to seventh, sequential descriptions that presuppose a temporal order, an earlier stage and a later stage, a trajectory that the practitioner could observe unfolding in a patient over weeks or months. They appear in incantation prescriptions keyed to specific stages of that progression, different countermeasure protocols for early-stage attachment versus middle-stage attachment versus late-stage integration, with the 5th stage explicitly identified as a diagnostic threshold that changes the entire treatment approach. They appear in the Sakiku handbook in conditional format. If the patient has been experiencing sleep disruption for a specific number of days and now presents appetite failure, the prognosis is this. If the cognitive disruption precedes the sleep disruption, the prognosis is different. The sequencing matters. The order of onset matters. The combination of signs matters. This level of combinatorial specificity does not emerge from literary imagination. It emerges from repeated observation of a phenomenon that unfolds in time and that presents differently depending on variables that the observer has learned to track. The texts appear with enough consistency across copies separated by centuries, from Old Babylonian exemplars through Middle Babylonian intermediaries to Neo-Assyrian canonical editions, and separated by hundreds of kilometers of geography, from Nippur to Babylon to Assur to Nineveh, that the pattern of description cannot be attributed to a single scribe's creative invention. This is a transmitted observational record maintained across institutional generations with the same copying protocols, the same colophon conventions, the same error correction practices used for astronomical and mathematical texts. The scribes treated this material as information that needed to remain accurate, and the institutional response of the modern world has been to classify it as literature and study its grammar. The dismissal did not take the form of a rebuttal. No paper has been published demonstrating that the symptom descriptions are internally inconsistent. No paper has been published showing that the diagnostic sequences do not hold across copies. No paper has been published arguing that the specificity is an artifact of translation bias or of selection effects in the surviving tablet corpus. The dismissal took the form of a category assignment. The Udug-hul tablets were placed in the genre of incantation literature, alongside hymns, prayers, and ritual laments. Once placed in that genre, their content was treated as secondary to their form. The philological work continued at the highest level of scholarly precision. The grammars were parsed, the variant sign values were catalogued, the scribal hands were identified and dated, the tablet's place in the Neo-Assyrian library system was mapped. But the question of content, what are these texts actually describing when they describe 7 distinguishable entities with 7 distinguishable symptom progressions, and why do the descriptions maintain their specificity across 1,000 years of transmission, was not asked. Not because it was asked and answered. Not because someone demonstrated that the question was ill-formed. It was not asked because the genre assignment made it unnecessary. If the texts are incantation literature, their content is expressive. If their content is expressive, the precision is aesthetic. If the precision is aesthetic, there is nothing to explain. The genre label functions as a container. Everything inside the container is literature, and literature does not require the kind of verification that observational records require. Consider how this plays out in practice. A doctoral student in Assyriology who wanted to write a dissertation examining the Udug-hul symptom descriptions as potential observational data, comparing the 7 constellations against modern diagnostic categories, testing whether the described progressions correspond to any identifiable clinical sequence, would face an immediate problem. The problem is not that the data does not exist. Geller published it. Scurlock and Anderson organised it. The problem is that the framing of the project falls outside the boundaries of what the discipline considers a legitimate research question. The texts are incantation literature. Studying their content as potential observation is, within the current disciplinary framework, a category error, like proposing to test whether Homer's descriptions of Olympian politics correspond to real events. The analogy is instructive because it reveals the assumption embedded in the genre assignment. The assumption is that we already know these entities do not exist, and therefore the text cannot be observational, and therefore the precision of the descriptions must have a non-observational explanation. The conclusion that the entities are not real functions as a premise, and premises, unlike conclusions, are not subject to challenge within the system that assumes them. This is not a conspiracy. It is something quieter and in some ways more durable, a disciplinary consensus that has never been formally argued and therefore cannot be formally challenged. No scholar published a paper titled "The Entities Described in the Udug-hul Do Not Exist, a Systematic Evaluation of the Evidence." No such paper was needed. The non-existence of the entities is the default assumption of the entire modern intellectual framework, imported into Assyriology from the broader Enlightenment settlement that separated the natural world from the supernatural one. The separation was productive. It made modern science possible, but it also made certain questions impossible, not because the questions are foolish, but because the framework has no mechanism for entertaining them. The Udug-hul's symptom descriptions sit in that blind spot. They are too precise to ignore and too categorically inconvenient to study on their own terms. The asymmetry bears repeating because it has not been addressed in any published forum. When the Mulapin Astronomical Compendium describes the rising dates of specific star groups with precision, scholars verify those dates against modern computations and find that they correspond to real observations made in specific centuries at specific latitudes. The precision is treated as evidence of genuine observation. When the Udug-hul describes symptom progressions with comparable internal consistency and comparable transmission fidelity, the precision is treated as evidence of literary sophistication. The same civilization produced both texts. The same scribal apparatus transmitted both texts. The same institutional libraries stored both texts. But one is treated as observational data, and the other is treated as cultural production. The reason for the difference in treatment is not empirical. It is categorical. Stars are things that exist. Entities that feed on human consciousness are things that, within the modern academic framework, do not exist. Therefore, the astronomical texts are observations, and the incantation texts are literature. The conclusion preceded the analysis, and no published paper has acknowledged this sequence. The Mesopotamian practitioners who worked with the Udug-hul texts were specialists operating within an institutional framework that modern scholars have documented in considerable detail. The Ashipu, the exorcist, though that English word carries misleading connotations of medieval Christianity, was a trained professional. The training was extensive. The surviving curricula from scribal schools at Nippur and at Babylon show that the Ashipu's education included years of cuneiform study, memorization of standard incantation series, training in diagnostic observation, and supervised practical work. The Ashipu was not a village shaman improvising rituals. The Ashipu was a credentialed specialist embedded in the same institutional system that produced astronomers, mathematicians, and administrative officials. The distinction matters because it bears on how we read the texts the Ashipu used. Texts produced by and for trained specialists within institutional frameworks tend to be operational. They tend to encode procedures that have been tested, refined, and standardized through institutional practice. The Udug-hul has the structural characteristics of an operational text: standardized terminology, decision protocols, procedural sequences contingent on diagnostic findings. It does not have the structural characteristics of devotional literature, which tends toward repetition of set phrases, invocation of divine names, and emotional escalation toward a climactic appeal. The Udug-hul escalates procedurally, not emotionally. Each tablet builds on the findings established in the previous tablet. The sequence is informational, not performative. The Ashipu's diagnostic process, as described in the texts, followed a structured protocol. The practitioner observed the patient. The practitioner asked specific questions documented in the diagnostic series that Scurlock and Anderson compiled. The practitioner compared the patient's symptom presentation against the known constellations associated with specific entity types. The practitioner determined the stage of progression: early attachment, established attachment, or fifth stage integration, and the practitioner selected the appropriate countermeasure protocol based on that determination. The protocols were not interchangeable. A protocol prescribed for a second stage attachment was explicitly described as ineffective against a fifth stage integration. A protocol prescribed for one entity type was explicitly described as inapplicable to another entity type. The texts include warnings about misdiagnosis, warnings that applying the wrong protocol would not merely fail but could accelerate the progression. These warnings appear across multiple copies. They are not scribal footnotes or marginal comments. They are embedded in the procedural text itself, in the same way that contraindication warnings are embedded in modern pharmaceutical references. The countermeasure protocols themselves have a structure that rewards examination. The Ashipu worked within configurations of spatial boundaries, lines drawn on the ground with specific substances including flour, bitumen, and certain mineral powders. Objects were placed at specific cardinal points around the patient. The patient was positioned at a specific orientation relative to the configuration. The texts describe these spatial arrangements not in symbolic or metaphorical terms, but in procedural terms: measurements, orientations, sequences of placement. If the configuration was established incorrectly, the texts warn the procedure would fail. That warning appears across copies separated by centuries and across copies from different cities. It is not a single scribe superstition. It is a transmitted operational caution. And operational cautions of this type, warnings that a procedure will fail if specific physical parameters are not met, are characteristic of practical manuals, not of literary texts. No one warns a reader that a poem will stop working if they read it facing the wrong direction. Practitioners are warned that procedures will fail if the configuration is wrong. This is the language of operational knowledge, and it has been filed under literature. The dual practitioner system of the ASU and the Ashipu deserves further examination because its structure illuminates how the Mesopotamians conceptualized the boundary between ordinary illness and entity-mediated affliction. The ASU, the herbal and surgical practitioner, worked primarily with plant-based remedies, mineral preparations, poultices, fumigations, and in some cases what appear to be minor surgical interventions. The ASU's texts are organized by affected body part: head, chest, stomach, limbs, and by symptom presentation. They contain recipes, dosage instructions, and preparation methods. They read, in many respects, like a pharmacopoeia. The Ashipu's texts are organized differently. They are organized by entity type, by symptom constellation, by stage of progression, and by the diagnostic criteria that distinguish entity-mediated affliction from natural illness. The existence of this boundary, the formal institutional recognition that some afflictions have natural causes and others have entity causes, means that attribution to entities was not the Mesopotamian default for all suffering. It was a specific attribution applied to specific presentations that met specific criteria. The diagnostic texts include cases in which the practitioner is instructed to determine that no entity is involved and to refer the patient to the ASU instead. This exclusion criterion is perhaps the strongest evidence that the Mesopotamian entity framework was not blanket superstition. A culture that superstitiously attributes all illness to demons does not develop exclusion criteria. A culture that observes two different categories of affliction, one responsive to material treatment and one responsive to a different kind of intervention, develops exactly the referral framework that the texts describe. The Maklu series provides the complementary framework. Where the Udug-hul describes the entities and their symptom progressions, the Maklu addresses cases of directed attachment, situations in which the entity was intentionally sent toward a specific person, rather than arriving through environmental contact. Zvi Abush of Brandeis University published the definitive edition of the Maklu through the series of the Harvard Semitic Museum. The Maklu runs to 9 tablets. Its rituals are structured as a single night-long sequence, beginning at dusk and concluding at dawn, with specific incantations performed at specific intervals throughout the night. The timing is not arbitrary or symbolic. The texts connect the ritual sequence explicitly to the movement of celestial bodies across the night sky, with specific procedural steps keyed to specific stellar positions. This implies a framework in which the entity's influence, their capacity to maintain attachment, their susceptibility to countermeasures, fluctuates in relationship to astronomical cycles. Abush's edition documents this internal structure with scholarly precision. What it does not address, what falls outside its stated philological scope, is the question of why a purely literary or symbolic tradition would require such exact astronomical timing. Metaphors do not need to be enacted at specific celestial alignments. Psychological comfort rituals do not require 9-tablet procedural sequences keyed to the transit of specific star groups across specific meridians. But the Maklu requires these things. The requirement is documented in the texts, and the documentation has been published. What the Maklu reveals, beyond its procedural content, is the sophistication of the Mesopotamian understanding of attachment as a phenomenon with multiple vectors. The Udug-hul addresses what might be called environmental or spontaneous attachment. The entity arrives, makes contact, begins to feed. The Maklu addresses directed attachment, cases in which a human agent, using specific techniques described in the witchcraft literature, deliberately sends an entity toward a specific target. The existence of both categories within the same institutional framework implies a taxonomy of causation. Not all attachments are the same, and the countermeasure depends on the vector. Abush's analysis of the Maklu's internal structure shows that the night-long ritual addresses the directed attachment by working backward through the chain of causation, first neutralizing the entity's active feeding, then severing the connection between the entity and the person who directed it, then establishing protections against reattachment. The sequence is not symbolic. It is procedural and contingent. Each step depends on the successful completion of the previous step, and the texts include diagnostic checkpoints at which the Ashipu evaluates whether the procedure is progressing correctly. The broader context of Sumerian and Akkadian civilization provides the background against which the precision of the Udug-hul should be evaluated. This was a civilization that invented writing not for literature but for inventory management. The earliest cuneiform tablets are grain receipts and livestock counts. The earliest cylinder seals are administrative authentication tools. The Sumerians measured the sky with instruments and methods precise enough to identify the precession of the equinoxes, a cycle of approximately 25,765 years. They divided the circle into 360 degrees and the hour into 60 minutes, divisions we still use because no one has improved on them in 4,000 years. They compiled the Mulapin series with observational entries spanning multiple centuries of systematic recording. They computed the synodic periods of the visible planets with errors of less than 1%. When these people documented something, they documented it with institutional rigor. This rigor was not limited to astronomy. The Mesopotamian legal tradition, codified in monuments like the Code of Hammurabi, now in the Louvre, demonstrates the same systematic approach applied to social behaviour. Every offence has a specified consequence, every contractual arrangement has specified terms, every property dispute has a specified adjudication process. The administrative archives from Ur during the Third Dynasty, approximately 2100 BCE, contain records of individual workers' daily grain rations tracked across years. The level of documentary precision is staggering by any historical standard, and the same civilization, with the same documentary habits, produced the Udug-hul. If they tracked grain rations with this precision, the assumption that they tracked entity symptom progressions with comparable precision is not extraordinary. It is expected. It would be more surprising if they had not applied their characteristic rigour to a phenomenon they clearly considered important enough to warrant 16 tablets of canonical documentation. The library of Ashurbanipal itself deserves attention as the context in which the Udug-hul was preserved. Ashurbanipal, the last great king of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, reigned from approximately 668 to approximately 631 BCE. He was unusual among Mesopotamian kings in being personally literate. He boasted in his royal inscriptions of his ability to read cuneiform, including the archaic Sumerian signs that most scribes of his era could not decipher. His library at Nineveh was not an accident of accumulation. It was a deliberate project. He sent agents to temples, scribble schools, and private collections across his empire, with orders to copy or confiscate important texts and send them to Nineveh. The selection criteria were not random. Ashurbanipal wanted comprehensive coverage of what his civilization considered essential knowledge: astronomical records, mathematical tables, medical diagnostics, ritual procedures, historical chronicles, and the incantation series including the Udug-hul. The fact that the Udug-hul was included in this collection, that the king of the most powerful empire on earth at that time considered it essential knowledge worth preserving, tells us something about how the Mesopotamians themselves classified these texts. They were not marginal superstitions. They were institutional resources, and the Udug-hul bears every structural hallmark of their documentary rigour: systematic categorization, internal cross-referencing, diagnostic decision trees, variant readings catalogued and reconciled, and transmission protocols designed to preserve informational accuracy across scribal generations. The scribes who copied these tablets were not copying poetry. They were copying what their institutional classification system identified as operational knowledge, and institutional classification systems, in Mesopotamia as in the modern world, reflect institutional use. The world the Ashipu inhabited was not the primitive landscape that the word ancient conjures in most modern imaginations. By the time the canonical Udug-hul was being compiled in the first millennium BCE, Mesopotamian civilization had already been continuously literate for more than 2,000 years. The cities of the alluvial plain, Ur, Uruk, Nippur, Babylon, Nineveh, had populations numbering in the tens of thousands. They had multi-story buildings, paved streets, sewer systems, codified law, international trade networks stretching from the Indus Valley to the Egyptian Delta, and bureaucracies that tracked every bushel of grain, every sheep, and every conscripted labourer with an accountant's obsessive precision. The Ashipu practised within this apparatus. The Ashipu was not a mystic in a cave. The Ashipu was a specialist embedded in an urban institutional system that demanded documentation, accountability, and results. The training texts from the Scribal Academy at Nippur, recovered by the University of Pennsylvania expedition in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, show that the Ashipu's curriculum was as rigorous as the curriculum for any other scribal specialization. Students copied standard incantation texts hundreds of times. They learned to identify entity types from textual descriptions. They memorized countermeasure protocols. They studied the Sakiku Diagnostic series until they could recite conditional sequences from memory: if this, then this; if that, then that. The final stage of training involves supervised clinical work under an established Ashipu, an apprenticeship in which the trainee observed diagnoses, assisted with counter-procedures, and gradually assumed primary responsibility for cases under supervision. The existence of this supervised practical component is itself noteworthy. Trades that deal primarily with abstractions, theology, philosophy, literary criticism, do not require supervised clinical practice. Trades that deal with real, variable, case-by-case phenomena medicine, engineering, navigation, agriculture would do. The Ashipu's training had the structure of a practical discipline dealing with real cases that varied and required judgment, not a theoretical discipline dealing with fixed doctrines that required memorization alone. The colophons on surviving Udug-hul tablets, the scribal notes appended at the end of each tablet identifying the copyist, the source copy, and the institutional context, provide additional evidence of how these texts were classified within the scribal system. Several colophons include the warning that the tablet's contents are restricted knowledge not to be shown to the uninitiated. This restriction is characteristic of operational texts in the Mesopotamian system. Literary texts, hymns, myths, epics, circulated relatively freely. They were part of the general scribal curriculum. Operational texts, diagnostic series, ritual procedures, astronomical computation methods were restricted to specialists. The Udug-hul was restricted. The Mesopotamian scribal system itself classified it as operational, not literary. The modern reclassification of these texts as literature contradicts the classification applied by the people who wrote, copied, used, and restricted them. The spatial configurations used in the countermeasure rituals have been documented by multiple scholars, but their physical specificity has not been evaluated on its own terms. In 1945, a sealed earthenware jar was discovered near the Egyptian town of Nag Hammadi, buried at the base of the Jabal al-Tarif cliff face. Inside the jar were 13 leather-bound codices, papyrus books, written in Coptic, dating to approximately the 4th century CE. They are now housed in the Coptic Museum in Cairo. Among them is a text titled The Hypostasis of the Archons, the Reality of the Rulers. It is catalogued as Codex II, Tractate 4 of the Nag Hammadi Library. James Robinson of Claremont Graduate University published the first comprehensive English translation of the library in 1977. And what the hypostasis of the archons describes is, in functional terms, the same phenomenon the Udug-hul describes: entities that feed on human beings, not by consuming flesh or blood, but by consuming something the Gnostic text calls awareness, the capacity of the human being to perceive its own condition accurately. The Gnostic cosmological framework is entirely different from the Sumerian framework. The terminology bears no linguistic relationship. The cultural context is separated by more than 2,000 years, by thousands of kilometers, and by the complete collapse and disappearance of cuneiform civilization in the intervening period. But the behavioral description of the entities is the same. The archons, as described in the Nag Hammadi texts, are not powerful in themselves. They are derivative. They are parasitic. They depend on human beings for something they cannot produce or sustain on their own. The texts describe this dependency in explicit terms. The archons feed on human ignorance, on human confusion, on the specific cognitive state in which the person does not recognize what is being done to them. The mechanism of feeding is not physical. It is cognitive. The archons consume the human's capacity for self-recognition. They thrive precisely when and precisely because the host does not know they are there. The Gnostic texts are remarkably specific about the operational mechanics. The archons do not simply drain awareness passively, the way a leech drains blood. They actively cultivate the conditions that sustain them. They promote confusion. They encourage distraction. They generate what the texts call a counterfeit spirit, an internal voice that mimics the person's own thinking and steers them toward choices that maintain the ignorance the archons require. On the Origin of the World, another tractate from the same Nag Hammadi library, describes the archons as unable to create anything genuinely original. They can only imitate and distort what already exists. They imitate the person's own cognition. They distort the person's own perception. And the person, encountering thoughts that carry the feel and texture of self-generated reasoning, does not recognize the imitation. This is the fifth sign rendered in entirely different vocabulary by writers who had no access to the Udug-hul tablets and no knowledge that cuneiform civilization had ever existed. The parallel to the Udug-hul's fifth sign is not vague thematic resonance. It is structural correspondence. Both traditions describe entities that depend on the host's failure to recognize the parasitic relationship. Both traditions identify the compromise of the recognition faculty as the critical threshold in the progression. Both traditions describe countermeasures that begin with the restoration of recognition, the Ashipu's Diagnostic Act in the Sumerian tradition, the concept of gnosis in the Gnostic tradition. Gnosis does not mean knowledge in the general sense. It means the specific knowledge that liberates, the moment of recognition in which the person sees the archon for what it is. The Sumerians and the Gnostics, separated by millennia, describe the same pivotal moment. The moment the host sees the parasite begins to lose its hold. The conventional explanation for cross-cultural parallels of this kind is diffusion. Ideas travelling along trade routes, transmitted through cultural contact between civilizations, absorbed into local frameworks and modified over time. Diffusion is a real and well-documented phenomenon. It accounts for the spread of flood narratives across the ancient Near East, for the transmission of astronomical knowledge from Mesopotamia to Greece, for the movement of artistic motifs along the Silk Road. But diffusion transmits narratives and concepts. It transmits stories, motifs, divine names, and cosmological structures. It does not typically transmit diagnostic protocols. The Udug-hul and the hypostasis of the archons do not share a narrative. They do not share characters, divine names, or cosmological architecture. What they share is a specific operational description, an entity type defined by its parasitic dependence on the host's unawareness, a progression that culminates in the compromise of the host's recognition faculty, and a countermeasure that targets that compromise directly. That level of structural specificity is not what diffusion typically produces. Diffusion produces recognizable cousins, stories that share a family resemblance, motifs that reappear in altered forms, divine names that shift pronunciation as they cross linguistic boundaries. The flood narrative appears across the ancient Near East, but in each culture it takes a different shape, different gods, different boats, different covenants. That is what diffusion looks like. These texts do not share a narrative shape, they share a mechanism. They share a specific description of how the entity operates, what it targets, and why the host cannot detect it. Mechanisms, unlike stories, do not travel well through cultural diffusion unless they describe something real that both cultures observed independently and documented based on their own experience. A story can be borrowed and retold. A diagnostic protocol is typically developed by people who have seen the condition it describes. On a different continent entirely, separated from both Mesopotamia and Egypt by an ocean, the Algonquin and Cree peoples of northeastern North America maintained a concept they called wetiko. Jack D. Forbes, who served as professor of Native American Studies at the University of California at Davis for more than 3 decades before his death in 2011, published the most thorough academic treatment of the wetiko concept in his 1978 book Columbus and Other Cannibals, later revised and reissued by Seven Stories Press in 2008. Forbes held a doctorate. He spent his career within the university system. He was not writing from a speculative or fringe position. He was documenting and interpreting an indigenous knowledge tradition that describes a specific form of psychospiritual infection, a cannibalistic parasitism of the mind, in which the affected person begins to consume the life energy, the well-being, and the agency of those around them while sincerely believing that their behavior is normal, justified, and self-determined. The parallels to the 5th sign of the Udug-hul are direct and difficult to dismiss as coincidence. The person does not know they are infected. Their behavior feels authentically their own. Their choices feel free and rational, but the choices serve the parasitic process rather than the person. Forbes was careful to ground the concept in the specific oral traditions and ceremonial knowledge of the peoples who originated it. He documented how wetiko was understood not as a metaphor but as a real condition, something an individual could contract, something that could spread through a community, and something that traditional healers had specific protocols for identifying and addressing. The identification process, as Forbes documented it, centered on a specific diagnostic criterion: the affected person's inability to recognize their own condition. The healer looked not for dramatic symptoms, but for a particular quality of self-assurance in the infected person, a certainty that nothing was wrong, a resistance to the suggestion that their behavior had changed. That diagnostic criterion, the use of the host's denial as a confirmatory sign, is functionally identical to the Sumerian diagnostic protocol for 5th stage attachment. The Algonquin had no contact with the Sumerians. They did not read cuneiform. They had no access to the library of Ashurbanipal. They developed their understanding on a separate continent, in a separate millennium through their own independent observation, and they arrived at the same diagnostic marker, to exploitation, to colonialism, to institutional violence. But the core of the concept as transmitted within the Algonquin tradition is not political, it is diagnostic. Wetiko is something that happens to a person, it has identifiable features, it progresses through stages, and the most dangerous stage, in the indigenous framework as in the Sumerian framework, is the stage at which the infected person loses the ability to recognize the infection, because the infection has reached the faculty of recognition itself. The Tibetan Buddhist tradition contributes a third independent description that converges on the same mechanism with striking precision. The Bardo Thodol, known in English-speaking countries as the Tibetan Book of the Dead, first translated into English by Walter Evans Wentz in 1927, describes states encountered between death and rebirth, in which entities attach to the consciousness of the deceased and redirect it. But the text's relevance extends beyond the post-mortem context. Tibetan commentarial traditions, particularly those of the Nyingma school, hold that the Bardo states described in the text are not exclusive to death. They are encountered in any moment of transition, including the transitions that occur within ordinary waking consciousness when awareness becomes unstable. The entities described in these transitional states feed specifically on confusion and on the consciousness's inability to recognize its own fundamental nature. They do not overpower, they do not attack with force, they attach to the moment of non-recognition, the instant when awareness fails to see itself clearly, and they feed on the confusion that follows. The Tibetan tradition describes these entities as projections that become autonomous, as if the mind's own confusion solidifies into something that then feeds back on the mind that generated it. The countermeasure prescribed by the text is, once again, recognition, rigpa, the Tibetan term for the naked awareness that sees through the projection and dissolves it. The moment the consciousness recognizes what is happening, the moment it sees the entity as a product of its own non-recognition rather than as an independent external force, the entity loses its hold and the consciousness is freed. 3. Traditions. 3 continents, 3 mutually independent cultural frameworks with no documented channel of transmission between them, no shared language, no shared scripture, no shared cosmology. And each one describes, in its own vocabulary and its own conceptual framework, the same parasitic mechanism, attachment that depends on the host's cognitive blindness, a staged progression toward the compromise of the recognition faculty, and liberation through the specific restoration of awareness. The Sumerian Ashipu performed a diagnostic act. The Gnostic initiate received gnosis. The Algonquin healer identified the Wetiko infection. The Tibetan practitioner recognized rigpa, 4 words in 4 languages across 4 millennia describing the same pivotal moment, the moment the host sees the parasite, and the parasite begins to lose its hold. The convergence is specific enough to be falsifiable. It is documented in published and accessible sources. It has not been studied as a convergence because the relevant scholars work in separate disciplines: Assyriology, Coptic studies, indigenous studies, Tibetan studies, and no discipline owns the comparative question. The data sits in 4 different academic silos, and the silo walls have held. The strongest published objection to this reading deserves to be stated in its full force, because the audience of this channel is better served by a steel-manned counter-argument than by a straw-manned one. And this particular counter-argument is strong. It has earned its place in the discussion not through institutional authority, but through genuine explanatory power. The objection is this: human beings across every culture and every historical period experience sleep disruption, cognitive confusion, appetite loss, social withdrawal, intrusive thoughts, unexplained somatic pain, and personality change. These are the presenting symptoms of major depressive disorder, of generalized anxiety disorder, of schizophrenia spectrum conditions, of complex post-traumatic stress disorder, of autoimmune conditions that affect the central nervous system, of nutritional deficiencies, and of severe social dislocation. These symptoms are real, they are universal, and every culture that has encountered them has developed an explanatory framework to account for them. The Sumerians attributed them to entities, the Greeks attributed them to humoral imbalance, medieval Europeans attributed them to demonic possession and to witchcraft. Modern clinical medicine attributes them to neurochemical dysfunction, to structural brain pathology, to epigenetic modification, and to adverse childhood experience. The objection holds that the Sumerian descriptions are precise because the underlying symptom experiences are real and universal. The entities are the explanatory layer, not the phenomenon. The specificity of the descriptions reflects careful empirical observation of human suffering, observation that was genuinely sophisticated and genuinely systematic, wrapped in a supernatural explanatory framework that was the best available to the culture at the time. Under this reading, the Sumerians were excellent diagnosticians and poor etiologists. They saw the symptoms clearly. They attributed the symptoms to the wrong cause. This objection is serious. It accounts for the universality of the symptom descriptions without requiring any actual entity to exist. It accounts for the cross-cultural parallels by noting that the same symptom set will naturally produce similar explanatory narratives in cultures that share a tendency to externalize the causes of suffering. It accounts for the diagnostic precision by attributing it to careful observation, the same observational skill that produced Mesopotamian astronomy, applied to medical phenomena and filtered through a supernatural lens. What this objection does not account for is the fifth sign, the specific, repeated, independently attested description of an agent that compromises the host's faculty of self-recognition, that mimics the host's own cognitive voice so precisely that the host cannot detect the mimicry, is not a standard feature of symptom descriptions in any medical tradition. Depression does not strategically disguise itself as the patient's own reasoning in order to avoid detection. Anxiety does not adapt its presentation to match the cognitive architecture of the individual host. Neurochemical imbalance does not target the specific neural pathway by which the patient would recognize a neurochemical imbalance. The fifth sign describes something with apparent agency, something that modifies its strategy in response to the host's cognitive structure, something that specifically targets the mechanism of detection. And that description appears, independently and without documented transmission, in Sumer, in Gnostic Egypt, in Algonquin North America, and in Tibet. The general objection that all cultures produce supernatural explanations for illness is valid and well supported. The specific objection that all cultures would independently produce the same precise description of a parasitic cognitive strategy specifically targeting the self-recognition faculty has not been made because the parallel has not been examined on these terms. The data is published, the translations are available, the comparison has not been conducted, the counter case remains genuinely unresolved, and intellectual honesty requires saying so. It is possible, and this possibility must be stated clearly, that the human mind, when experiencing certain categories of severe cognitive disruption, universally generates the subjective narrative of an external agent that has infiltrated and hijacked the thinking process. The experience of ego-dystonic thought, thought that feels foreign despite originating internally, is well documented in modern clinical literature. It appears in obsessive-compulsive disorder, in post-traumatic intrusion, in the prodromal phases of psychotic illness, and in the dissociative disorders. It is possible that this experience, occurring in a pre-scientific cultural context, is naturally externalized as entity attachment, that the fifth sign is not a description of an external phenomenon, but a remarkably precise description of how the human mind experiences and narrativizes its own internal dysfunction. Under this reading, the Sumerians were not observing a parasite. They were observing themselves, observing the mind's experience of its own breakdown, and constructing an explanatory model that attributed internal processes to external agents, because external agency was the most available explanatory framework their culture possessed. This is a defensible and intellectually serious position. It has genuine explanatory power. It accounts for the universality of the descriptions without requiring any external entity to exist. But it has not been rigorously tested against the full specificity of the ancient descriptions, and the level of cross-cultural convergence on the mechanism, not merely on the general symptom of intrusive thought, which is indeed universal, but on the specific attributed strategy of cognitive mimicry targeting the self-recognition faculty. The specific description of a parasitic agent that learns to speak in the host's own voice, the specific identification of the host's denial as a confirmatory diagnostic marker, is tighter and more structurally precise than the general objection would predict. If ego-dystonic thought universally generates the narrative of external hijacking, we would expect the narratives across cultures to share a general theme of invasion or possession. We would not necessarily expect them to independently converge on the same specific operational mechanism, the strategic targeting of recognition, the mimicry of the host's cognitive voice, the use of the host's resistance to diagnosis as evidence that the diagnosis is correct. That level of convergence on a specific mechanism across 4 continents and 5 millennia with no documented channel of transmission is not predicted by the general objection. The question is open. The published data exist to test it. The test has not been performed. If the Sumerians were describing an observed phenomenon, if the 7 symptom constellations recorded in the Udug-hul represent something real operating on human consciousness, then several things follow that would require revisions to how we understand both ancient and modern knowledge. The first is that the modern diagnostic categories used to explain these symptom presentations may be descriptions of the same underlying process, viewed through a different interpretive framework, that the neurochemical model and the entity model are both describing genuine observations, with the disagreement located not in the data but in the explanatory superstructure applied to the data. The second is that the countermeasure protocols documented in the Udug-hul and the Maklu, the spatial configurations, the substance selections, the astronomical timing, the staged interventions with diagnostic checkpoints, may encode procedural knowledge developed through centuries of institutional practice, knowledge discarded not because it was tested and found ineffective, but because the conceptual framework it belonged to was abandoned wholesale during the Enlightenment reorganization of knowledge. The third consequence is that the cross-cultural convergence on the 5th sign may represent multiple independent observations of the same phenomenon, the same parasitic targeting of host self-recognition, observed on 4 continents across 5,000 years by cultures with no documented contact, which would make it one of the most broadly and independently attested observations in the entire pre-modern record. And the fourth is that the question the Sumerians pressed into clay and stored in the library of a king who believed it mattered enough to preserve, what feeds on human awareness while disguising itself as human awareness, and how does a person recognize the parasite once it has compromised the organ of recognition, may remain unanswered not because the ancient world failed to ask it clearly, but because the modern world classified the question as superstition before examining the evidence on which it was based. The tablets are in the British Museum. They have been there since Rassam's team shipped them from the ruins of Nineveh in the 1850s. Geller's critical edition has been in print since 2007 and is available through the Neo-Assyrian Text Corpus Project in Helsinki. Scurlock and Anderson's Diagnostic compilation is in print from the University of Illinois Press. Forbes's treatment of the Wetiko concept is in print from 7 Stories Press. The Nag Hammadi codices are in the Coptic Museum in Cairo, and Robinson's translations have been available in English since 1977. The sources are published. The translations exist. The parallels have been documented by scholars working independently within their own fields. The question of what the Sumerians observed, what they catalogued with the same institutional precision they used for the movements of the planets, and why 7 independent descriptions across 4 continents converge on the same mechanism of parasitic attachment through cognitive mimicry has not been answered. It has not been seriously asked. The tablets are where they have always been. The question is still open,